Welcome to the Growth in Life Virtual Mentoring Series. Today's installment is on event planning. Our speakers today are Director of Music and Web, Amanda.
Hello.
Our Director of Social, Audio, and Visual, Allison.
Hi.
And myself, Lynn, co-founder of Petite to Queen. So let's get started. And I'm going to get us going with where to start. Where do you start when you're planning a big event? And I want to say, first of all, there is no right or wrong way to start an event. One of the things that can be super effective is a sticky note method. And, so this can be very simple. So you have a brainstorming session with your family or a family member, a friend, or a couple people to plan the event, and you just start putting sticky notes out. All you need is a large surface, a wall, a counter, front door, whatever works, a sticky notes and a pen, and you just start to let the ideas and your thoughts flow. And you start filling out sticky notes and setting them out on this large surface so that you can move them around, so that you can start putting them into categories. And as you start to wade through the details, you'll start to see a basically like an inverted tree flowing. So you've got the event at the top, and then you've got some major categories, and you're starting to fill in for how all the different things that you'd like to look into, or you need to research, or you definitely want, so you have to source that, time commitments, things that are dependent upon each other. And you're going to form this really great inverted tree, like I mentioned, or a pyramid. And you can then start to change out the colors of your sticky notes, so that you have colors, you might have follow the red light, green light, red for it's really critical that this gets done right away. Green, we already know what we need, and it's good to go. Those types of things. You could also use different colors of ink, or like get some Sharpies and then just use the normal yellow sticky notes, but use colors on the sticky notes so that you could see. Once again, it gives you a visual. I mean, that's why I would do that, so that you can see your deadlines and priorities. And so when you're done with all of that, you've organized your tasks and put them into categories. Another thing is that you don't have to do the sticky note idea. That's just one idea. I really am very focused on, I put everything down. I just start making lists, and then I start to organize my thoughts that way, and then I organize them into a binder. So that's sort of another way. And along with this, when you're starting out and you've done this big picture mapping, now you know where you need to either research, what are possible suppliers or vendors or venues, or you can say, these are things I really want, and all I need to do is source them. And so I've got a list of a couple good caterers, and now I'm going to reach out to them and get pricing, to cater the event. So that's how and where to start for me. Amanda, how does this ring to you, and how would you start, or where would you start?
Well, thank you, Lynn. You certainly have a whole process certainly figured out at this point. You've planned so many events in your life. Unlike Lynn, who is a queen of planning and hosting spectacular events, I've only really been in charge of one, but it was a big one, my wedding. I'd only ever been to 2 weddings in my life, and I was a flower girl at one of them. Understandably, I didn't know much about weddings when I was getting into this. So the first thing I needed to do was research a lot. I searched online for things I could think of, but I ended up going down a whole rabbit hole of information and ideas, things I'd never even considered or thought of in my life. I started with a basic Google search, but I ended up scouring wedding websites, magazines, Pinterest, you name it. I started by writing down high-level items that I'd need to keep in mind. Some of my big to-dos were finding a venue, getting the dress, picking the invitations, and the list went on and on. Whenever you plan an event, there will be a specific deadline. What day is the event? In my case, it got a bit more complicated. My husband is from out of the country, and we were living abroad at the time. Before he could return to the US, he needed his fiancé visa. And once he was here, we'd have only 90 days to get married. That made wedding planning extra hard, doing as much as I could from outside of the country before we returned in April, and then squeezing in everything else in just a 3-month span. That's a very specific time frame to work with. And these are just some of the first things that I had to consider when I was getting started with planning. Allison, what do you think about getting started?
Well, I think those are all really great ideas. I really especially like the idea of the post-it notes, and I make tons and tons of lists. That's what I do. That's how I make tons and tons of to-do lists. And actually have a question for you guys, and it has to do with factoring in your budget. How do you factor in your budget from the very beginning?
Well, I think I could respond to that pretty well. That was something I definitely had to work with when you're planning a wedding. It's super important to have a general idea of what your budget is going into whatever event it is you're planning. So with my wedding, I made a list of all the items we would need to pay for, the dress, the flowers, the venue, etc. Figure out your total budget, your total number, and then start breaking that down for each of the items. Try to guess as best you can how much each item should cost. What I did was I made a maximum amount for each of the items that I would be willing to spend, but I always tried to go under budget when I could find a good deal. What I did was I kept track of all of this in a huge spreadsheet. So I had the item listed, and then the maximum dollar amount that I would be willing to spend on it, and then I listed out the actual amount I paid for it. And that was a really good way for me to keep track of how my budget was going throughout the entire process.
Yeah, I'm going to pitch in too that that's a great idea to really know what your maximum budget you want to spend and trying to go under that, because there are always unexpected expenses that come up, that crop up, or things that you realize that, I hadn't budgeted for this, but I'd really like to do it. And so when you go under budget on other items, it sort of gives you that extra little, you know, bucket of cash
Absolutely.
to spend on either the unexpected or things that you discover along the way.
Yeah,
All
that is
right.
a great point.
Okay, so next we are going to be talking about breaking the task down. And Amanda, you've obviously been through this big event just within the last few years. So why don't you start?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the previous slide, I did talk about writing down your high-level to-do list, and depending on the scale of your event, that will only be so helpful. It's vitally important that you then break those tasks down. For each high-level item on the to-do list, break it down into all the sub-items that go into it. For example, if you're planning a wedding, like I was, you may have written down that you'll need a cake, but it's not that simple. First, you have to think about what kind of cake you want, or if you even want a cake at all. Some people go with cupcakes or donuts or any other number of options. Then, once you've decided that you do in fact want a cake or one of these other sweets, you have to think about what flavors you want, how it should look, the details that will make it special, how big will the cake need to be to feed your guests, and you have to research where you can get the dessert and then start scheduling tastings at those top choices. And it goes on and on and on. And that's just the cake. That's the kind of thing you'll have to think about for each of the high-level items. Break it down into all the little things that you'll have to do along the way. Once you have your master to-do list figured out, it's important that you determine who will do what and when those things need to be completed. So many items will need to be checked off before another item can even begin. As I mentioned before, when planning my wedding, I had to determine what could be done from abroad and what I would need to do in person, what I could do many months in advance, and what would need to be completed closer to the event. I knew early on that I'd have to delegate, and luckily I had my lovely family members to help me out. My mom was super helpful in scoping out potential wedding venues. My sister helped a ton with picking the wedding dress. And my aunt, Lynn here, she took on all of these huge tasks like hosting the rehearsal dinner and making decorations and adjusting my wedding gown and the bridesmaid gowns. Everyone took on all these responsibilities with enthusiasm and grace, and they often helped me make the most important decisions and even brought up ideas that I hadn't even considered. I couldn't have pulled off the event without all of the help I received. So it's important to Really break it down and see who can help you and where they can help you. Lynn, do you have anything to add to that?
That is really what it's about. And I think that one thing I know that I do is I've already mentioned is that I really organize everything into a binder that I can take with me. So if I'm going to an appointment and I might have to sit there and wait, like at the dentist or the doctor, I can still take my little binder along with me, and I can actually take a notepad that fits right in it, or I have some 8.5 by 11 sheets, grid sheets that I've already 3-hole punch, so they're in that, and I can actually, it gives you that moment to sort of collect yourself because you're just sort of waiting there anyway. And instead of picking up the People magazine, I'll go back, run through, because you've got to constantly be checking on where you're at with everything, and have those running to-do lists and getting them updated and making sure that you're checking off all those loose ends. So that's one thing I'd recommend. Allison, what are your thoughts?
Well, I actually have a question. You mentioned, Amanda, delegating out tasks to different people, and I think sometimes when you're working with people on planning an event, sometimes people they don't do what they are supposed to, and so my question is, how do you motivate somebody you're planning an event with to do their part?
Well, I'm actually going to raise my hand and take this one, since I was one of those individuals who was delegated to with Amanda. And I think the key to engagement, or the key is engagement. So for the friend or family member, they need to feel part of the action. Uh, Not that this is some kind of onerous task, rather they are engaged and they're involved, and even in some of the decisions, they have the ability to toss their thoughts into the hat and get really feel like they're part of the event and part of the task and the responsibility that they're performing. It gives them a sense of ownership, and that's my feeling for how to get someone motivated and make sure that they're involved and carry out their responsibilities. All right, so let's move on. If everybody's good with that, we're going to talk about resources. And I'm going to go ahead and, Amanda, let you take the lead on this again, since you just went through this.
Thank you, Lynn. Well, it's so important to know what you're working with. Be realistic and don't overestimate how much money or time you have to put into this. And you have to know who you can depend on for help. I touched on this before, but you need to know your budget going into this. You might be flexible with the budget, and it might change a bit during the process, but in general, it's good to stick to it as best you can. When planning, write down a list of everything you'll need to pay for and a guesstimate of its price range. From your budget, divvy up the money and determine the maximum amount of money you want to spend on each item. And when you're making your purchases, try not to go over that amount. Even better, try to get deals where you can. Unexpected expenses have a tendency of creeping up on you, as Lynn already mentioned, so it's best to be prepared for those. Another big resource is time. This isn't just time constraints and deadlines, it's also the bandwidth and that you and anyone helping you has. Sure, you could plan to work 5 hours a night every night after you've gotten home from work, but will you actually be able to sustain that energy and motivation? Probably not. Don't overestimate the bandwidth you have. You may need to cut out certain things that you simply don't have enough time for. You may need to look into alternatives that are less time consuming. You may need to delegate to anyone that's willing to help, but just don't ask too much of their time. Keep their bandwidth and time availability in mind as much as you're keeping your own bandwidth and time availability in mind. So, Lynn, what do you think about resources?
Oh, I think the number one thing to remember is to set realistic expectations and be ready to pivot. So you absolutely have to be flexible, because there's going to be some last minute changes. And those are the best tips that I can provide. Allison, what tips or thoughts do you have on resources?
Well, I have another question. Suppose you really want to have your event at a certain venue, but it doesn't quite fit into your budget. How do you compromise on things you really want but don't necessarily fit into your resources?
This is such a great question. When I was planning my wedding, one of my main constraints was our budget. The average wedding cost nearly $30,000, but my fiance and I agreed that we couldn't even spend half of that amount. So some things we would have to cut out, like the videographer or having a huge guest list. But if it's something you really want or even need, you may be able to find some great deals on some of the other things that you're planning for your event. My sister found a wedding dress that was only $300, which is a steal as far as bridal gowns go. And it was a perfect dress. It made me feel like Cinderella. I'd wanted to have a string quartet play during the ceremony, but I actually compromised and ended up hiring a cello soloist instead. And in regards to the venue, if it's something that's out of your budget, you could consider the rest of your budget. What are other things that you can cut or pay a lower amount that will leave you a little bit of extra cash that can go into that dream venue? And if it's completely out of your budget, you never know. You might be able to find a good deal somewhere else at a place that looks really similar and has the right feel, but it won't eat into your budget nearly as much. If the constraint is time, then you might want to see who can help you or find quicker alternatives. And don't be afraid to compromise on things. They might actually be a pleasant surprise and achieve your goals without breaking the bank or the clock.
All right, that's terrific. So let's talk about adding the special touch to your event. And Amanda, let's have you lead off yet again.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lynn. Well, whatever event you're planning, it's a special event. Whether it's for you or for a loved one, you want to make it feel personalized. Don't forget to add a special touch to it. Think of ways that you can make the event unique. Depending on it, you might have tons of room for creativity, or you might just have a little bit of wiggle room. A big one is coming up with a perfect playlist. Music is so personal to a lot of people. It can remind you of special times in your life or just make you feel really happy. Pick out your favorite songs, or if the event is for another person, pick songs that you know they love. You can even organize the playlist to have the perfect transitions and flow throughout the whole evening, or day, depending on what the event is. You can also pick out decorations that fit a certain theme or are your favorite colors. You could try making a delicious dessert that's your own special recipe, or maybe it's a recipe you learned while traveling somewhere. And think about any unique activities that your group size can enjoy together that may fit the theme of the event. I know my sister has thrown parties at her house and she had a mystery theme. And so she ended up coming up with a fun mystery game. It was like a life-size version of Clue, where someone was the murderer and you had to figure out who did it and where and with what weapon. And that's just one fun way to get the whole group involved in a way that fits the theme. So Lynn, what do you think about adding special touches to events?
Well, I really want to touch on doing a custom presentation. And I really want to, ask, if you want to do something like that and to create a custom presentation, how much time should you plan for the production?
Well, I think I can speak to this because as director of social, audio, and visual, I certainly do produce a lot of video. And I think that it really depends on what kind of presentation you're making, what resources you already have, and the length of the presentation you're trying to make. It takes a lot of time to make a custom presentation or video. So if you're doing it yourself, you should block out at least a few hours to do it, maybe more if you're doing a video. And you need to take into consideration whether you need to gather images, graphics, or video clips, and also if you have the skills to produce your presentation or video. Because sometimes you can just use software like PowerPoint, but other times you'd need to use things like iMovie or Final Cut Pro for video production. But if you're doing a PowerPoint type presentation, it's going to be easier than producing an entire video. So to answer your question, you need to take into consideration that making a custom presentation could take up a whole lot of your time.
Perfect. Yeah. Sort of the rabbit hole that Amanda mentioned earlier.
Right.
Sounds like. Okay, so let's talk about flawless execution. And of course, there you have it. Especially if you're looking at doing a video. So that's a real, like, really, how long is this going to take? And I think that's one thing that you have to consider. This is where the time you spent planning and developing your event plan and a backup plan really helps. And so my key tips are to review and update your to-do list. If you remember something, think of it right then and write it down. I keep little tiny scratch pads with me at all times, and then I sort of compile them every day, because if I don't write it down, this thought comes into my head and I'm like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, I got to do that. And I get on to the next thing and I've forgotten it. And then it's the next day, oh my gosh, I was supposed to do that. I still didn't do it. So I just write it down right away. And that way it doesn't get missed. And it helps me a lot. You absolutely have to do those follow up on all the loose ends and the really vitally important items. Make sure that reconfirm that the cellist is going to be there at the right time. All those different things that you need to make sure that everything's lining up. And my last thing is you absolutely have to be flexible. If you get so caught up in one little thing that went sideways, it's gonna almost like taint how you feel about the event, because you were so wanted something and it just isn't going to come together. You have to be able to let it go, and pivot and be flexible. Have a backup plan for really big things so that you know what could happen. So if you're having an outside venue, what if it rains? You've got to have a backup plan to prepare for it, because what if it's a monsoon? I mean, you have to have a backup plan for anything that's vitally important. And like I said, just remember about all those loose ends. And I think Amanda has a very funny story about a loose end, and I'm going to pitch the baton to her.
I do, and I know you remember it. What you said about forgetting things is so true. I know I keep talking about my wedding, but I have the perfect story to illustrate this point. I had my bachelorette party the day before my wedding, and it was super fun. We went horseback riding, and then we were going to get our nails done, and it was just a great girls' day out. On the way to the nail salon, I got a phone call from the people who made the wedding cake. I had completely forgotten my wedding cake. They were pretty sure I still wanted it, and the store was about to close for the rest of the weekend. They were kind enough to stay open for another hour until someone picked it up. But who was going to pick it up? Luckily for me, my lovely cousin Francesca saved the day. She volunteered to miss out on getting her nails done just so she could drive down there with my fiance to pick up the cake. It would have been such a disaster to have no cake, and I'm so glad that she was able to be flexible and help me with my own forgetfulness. I'd planned the whole thing as well as I could, but somehow picking up the cake completely slipped my mind at the last minute. So I'm so glad my cousin had my back that day. It was a crazy event, but that's just one way to remember that what can go wrong will go wrong, and it's always good to be flexible, and if you plan it well enough, you can minimize these little mini disasters and not let them grow into something even worse.
Allison?
Well, I actually have a question. And what happens if you absolutely need to cancel an event?
Okay, I'm gonna take the lead on this one. Do it as soon as you realize you need to cancel. Okay, stuff happens. That's just the way life is. And what's important is getting the word out, emails, phone trees, social, even snail mail, if there's time for it. And I want to bring one more thing up too. Have the courage to cancel an event. Sometimes it requires that courage to say, this isn't right. And I'm going to tell a quick story. I have a very good friend who, the day of her wedding, she's in her dress, she's looking in the mirror, and she had this epiphany. And it had been building for a long time, that she shouldn't marry this individual, that this was not right. But she felt all the pressure of the event, and that she was there and she had to go through with the wedding. And rather than having the courage to say, no, I'm not going to do this, this isn't right, she did. She walked down that aisle and she was divorced in less than a year. And, that's the thing. That's a sort of a horrible scenario, but I want to tell you, everyone, you have to have the courage to face things like that. It's not just cold feet, in that case. And that's so important. So if something horrible does happen, you need to cancel an event. It could also be something, that's very personal that occurs, that you just can't see yourself moving forward with the event. Maybe a loved one has passed. Whatever it happens to be, these are always unfortunate circumstances. Sometimes they're things that you can laugh about later, like, the venue that we had, they had a flood. They had a leak in their roof and the whole ballroom flooded and we couldn't have it there. And we ended up moving the venue, and it becomes this great story that you get to tell years later. So no matter what, just handle it with grace and get out there and get out front as soon as you can, and just have the courage to face it head on. So this is our last slide for our presentation, and it's chill and have fun. Especially coming after the the canceling the event, right? So I want to say, do not forget to plan how you will enjoy your own event. There have been so many times that I have spent an entire event running around like a chicken with my head cut off, taking care of guests, cleaning up as I went, and I barely had a moment to sit down or speak with anyone. So you need to enjoy your own event. And, the tip I have to ensure that you have a good time is during and after the party is to plan how things are going to get cleaned up, so that you aren't sitting there being everyone's, table waiter. Instead, you've got a plan in place, and leave yourself, that ability to actually visit and enjoy the event. And you also then avoid the complete disaster after an event of looking at, okay, now I've got to clean everything up. It makes that whole event feel like a burden or work. So having a cleanup plan is my number one tip, to make sure that you can chill and have fun. Amanda, what are your thoughts?
Well, what you said is so true. Remember, this isn't supposed to be work, it's supposed to be fun. Not everything will be perfect, but if you planned it well, it'll work out well enough. Don't sweat the small stuff. No one will notice or care if something small doesn't work out exactly as planned. And if there's a big oops, at least you can all laugh about it together. The reason you're having this event is to bring people together to celebrate. Let that be reason enough, and just enjoy the event that you pulled off. You did great. Allison, what would you like to add about chilling and having fun?
Well, first of all, you should absolutely have fun at your event. I mean, because it's your event. So, you really should have fun. Those were all really good points that you guys made. I think that you guys pretty much covered it all.
All right. Well, then we want to just finish with saying thank you. Thank you to all our members and guests who've joined us for this installment of Growth in Life Virtual Mentoring Series, and for being part of the dialogue here at Petite to Queen. If you have a question or would like to suggest topics for discussion, please email us at jointheconversation@petitetoqueen.com.